I sat at the family dinner table when my father looked me dead in the eye and announced my luxury vacation ticket was revoked. "It is only for family," he said, "and without a husband or kids, I simply did not qualify." My sister and her husband laughed as they claimed my oceanfront suite. I did not scream, I did not cry, I just quietly walked out. What they conveniently forgot was that the corporate black card funding their entire lavish lifestyle had my name on it. When my father tried to drop $5,000 a few days later, I hit block and sent a 3-word text that shattered his fake empire. The air inside my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate was thick with the smell of roasted lamb, garlic butter, asparagus, and heavy pretension. It was our usual Sunday family dinner, a ritual I had endured for years, out of a misplaced sense of duty. I am Kendra. I am 35 years old and I work as a senior wealth manager at a top-tier financial firm in the city. My life is a relentless cycle of 60-hour work weeks, analyzing portfolios, managing high-net-worth clients, and building my own independence. I was exhausted running on pure caffeine and the promise of our upcoming luxury family trip to Cabo San Lucas. I had been looking forward to that white sand and blue water for 6 solid months. I pushed my food around my plate, trying to engage in the conversation. I took a sip of my sparkling water and offered a tired but genuine smile. "I cannot wait for our vacation next week," I said, setting my glass down. "I really need to disconnect. 60 hours this week alone has my brain completely fried. Cabo is going to be the perfect reset for all of us." The clinking of silverware against fine china stopped. The silence that fell over the dining room was immediate and suffocating. My father Desmond, a man whose pride was only outmatched by his arrogance, slowly cut a piece of his steak. He did not look up at me. He simply chewed his food, swallowed, and let out a low, mocking laugh that echoed in the cavernous room. "It is only for family, Kendra." He said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather rather than cutting me out of a trip I had spent months planning. "You are not coming. Without you, it will actually be a family trip." I froze. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Across the table, my older sister Jada let out a loud, cruel snort of laughter. Jada was the undisputed golden child of the family. She had failed out of her marketing degree program 3 separate times, but she had managed to marry Garrett, a white man, with a supposedly impressive background who fit perfectly into my parents' vision of elevated social status. Garrett leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon, and joined in his wife's laughter. The sound of his smug, entitled chuckle in my parents' dining room grated against my every nerve. I looked toward my mother, expecting some kind of intervention, some baseline level of maternal defense. Yvonne simply adjusted her silk blouse, took a delicate sip of her red wine, and looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. "Be reasonable, Kendra," my mother said smoothly, completely unbothered by the cruelty of the moment. "You are single and childless. Jada and Garrett need the extra space. They need your oceanfront suite for the kids. It just makes more sense. Besides, you would just bring down the mood anyway. You are always so serious and focused on work. A family vacation is for people who have actually built a family." The sheer audacity of her statement felt like a physical blow to my chest. I did not scream. I did not throw my napkin down. I did not burst into tears like the fragile, broken daughter they desperately wanted me to be. Instead, I sat perfectly still and let my eyes wander around the room, taking in the physical evidence of their staggering hypocrisy. I looked down at the massive custom-built mahogany dining table where we were all seated. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that seated 12 people comfortably. My father loved to brag about it to his golf buddies. What he never mentioned was that I was the one who quietly paid for it. When his real estate brokerage missed a crucial quarter 2 years ago, and he was facing the humiliation of downsizing, I was the one who wrote the check to keep his image intact. I looked up at the glittering crystal chandelier hanging above us, another luxury I had funded to maintain the illusion of Desmond's unstoppable success. I went to Howard University on a full academic scholarship because my parents refused to pay my tuition, claiming they needed the funds to support Jada's endless attempts at finding herself. I built my career from the ground up. I earned every promotion, every bonus, every ounce of respect I held in the financial district. I had been paying the second mortgage on this very estate for 3 years, keeping the roof over their heads while they paraded around Atlanta high society. And yet, sitting here, I was nothing to them but an ATM they could insult for entertainment. The silence stretched on heavy with their expectation that I would apologize for making things awkward, or perhaps beg to be included, promising to pay for my own separate room. Garrett smirked at me, clearly enjoying the dynamic where the successful black woman was put in her place by her own family. Jada whispered something to him, and they shared another quiet laugh. I slowly reached for my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my untouched plate. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, her voice laced with irritation. "We have not even served dessert yet." "Do not be dramatic, Kendra." I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of my anger. I simply looked at my father, who finally raised his eyes to meet mine. I nodded politely, a gesture so cold and detached it made his confident expression waver for just a fraction of a second. "Enjoy your dessert," I said evenly, "and enjoy Cabo." I turned and walked out of the dining room. I retrieved my designer coat from the entryway closet, slipping it on as I opened the heavy front door. I stepped out into the cool Atlanta evening, pulling the door shut behind me with a firm, decisive click. I did not slam it. Slamming it would imply I was out of control. I was entirely in control. I walked down the manicured driveway to my car, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pristine paving stones. I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle, relishing the absolute quiet of the insulated cabin. The engine hummed to life, but I did not put the car in drive right away. I sat there, the streetlights reflecting off my windshield, processing the reality of what had just happened. My family had explicitly told me I meant nothing to them beyond what I could provide. They had drawn their line in the sand. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my secure banking application, bypassing the biometric lock, and navigated to the corporate accounts section. There it was, the exclusive corporate black card. The lifeblood of Desmond's real estate brokerage, and the magical plastic that funded his expensive suits, his lavish dinners, and his upcoming family vacation. The account was entirely under my name. It was backed by my credit, my assets, my hard work. I had set it up years ago as a lifeline when his business was failing, allowing him to save face and pretend he was still the king of his castle. I stared at the screen, watching the numbers reflect a reality my family chose to ignore. My thumb hovered over the settings menu. I navigated to the card management controls. The words "lock account" glowed on the screen. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. They wanted a family vacation without me. They were about to learn exactly how much of their family was built on my back. I thought about Jada packing her designer luggage, preparing to lounge by an infinity pool that I was financing. I thought about Garrett drinking top-shelf liquor on my dime, while looking down his nose at me. I thought about my mother, who cared more about the optics of a perfect family photo on a beach than the feelings of her own daughter. And I thought about my father, a man so blinded by his own toxic pride that he believed he could bite the hand that fed him without ever facing starvation. They had demanded I respect their boundaries regarding what constitutes a family. It was only right that I enforce my own boundaries regarding what constitutes my money. The days of silent compliance were over. The days of buying their conditional love were finished. I took one last look at the glowing facade of my parents' estate through my rearview mirror. It looked like a fortress, but I knew it was nothing more than a house of cards. And I was holding the bottom card, my thumb pressed down on the screen. The application processed the request for a brief moment before a green checkmark appeared, confirming the action. The corporate account was frozen. The credit line was severed. The financial umbilical cord was officially cut. I put the car in drive and pulled out onto the quiet street, leaving their toxic world behind me. The panic had not started yet, but I knew it was coming, and for the first time in my 35 years, I was looking forward to the fallout. 3 days passed since I walked out of my parents' dining room. 72 hours of absolute profound silence from the people who were supposed to be my family. There were no apologies. There were no phone calls, asking if I had made it home safely. There was not a single text message trying to smooth over the blatant disrespect they had served me alongside Sunday dinner. They simply assumed I would swallow the humiliation retreat to my corner and continue funding their lavish lifestyle just like I always did. They believed my compliance was a permanent fixture in their lives. They were gravely mistaken. I was sitting in my sleek downtown high-rise office surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was immersed in a complex portfolio restructuring for one of my top-tier clients. My office was a sanctuary of quiet focus, a testament to the success I had built entirely on my own merits. I was reviewing a quarterly earnings report when my personal cell phone vibrated against the polished surface of my desk. I glanced at the screen expecting a message from a client or perhaps a reminder from my assistant. Instead, it was an automated fraud alert from my private banking concierge. The message was clear and glaring. Did you attempt a charge of $5,000 at Azure Luxury Travel and Excursions Cabo San Lucas? Please reply yes or no to confirm. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I read the notification again, letting the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the situation wash over me. They were actually doing it. They had kicked me out of the family vacation, laughed in my face, told me my single and childless status made me a burden, and then they had the absolute nerve to use my corporate credit card to upgrade their oceanfront suites and book private excursions. $5,000 for yacht rentals and private cabanas that I was explicitly forbidden from enjoying. They really believed my money was their birthright, completely detached from any requirement of basic human respect. I picked up my phone, but I did not just tap the decline button. A simple decline would only prompt my father to call the bank and try to authorize the charge himself, pretending it was a simple misunderstanding. I needed to send a message that could not be misinterpreted or overridden. I pulled up my contacts and dialed the direct line to my dedicated wealth manager. He answered on the second ring with his usual crisp professionalism. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I instructed him to immediately decline the pending $5,000 charge from the travel agency, but I did not stop there. I kept my voice calm and perfectly steady as I ordered him to permanently freeze the entire corporate account. I told him to revoke all authorized users instantly. I explicitly listed the names to be removed from the account: Desmond, Yvonne, Jada, Garrett. I listened to the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard as he processed my requests. Within 2 minutes, he confirmed that the action was complete. The sleek, heavy metal black cards, sitting in their designer wallets, were now nothing more than useless, deactivated pieces of scrap metal. The financial umbilical cord was officially and permanently severed. I thanked my banker, ended the call, and set my phone back down on my desk. A strange, powerful sense of calm settled over my chest. For years, I had allowed them to use my hard-earned wealth to prop up the illusion of their success. My father loved to parade around Atlanta, swiping that card at exclusive steakhouses and country clubs, playing the role of the self-made patriarch who provided for his entire family. He loved the image of generational wealth. He just hated acknowledging that the wealth was generated solely by the daughter he constantly belittled. I picked up my phone one more time and opened our family group chat. The chat was ironically named The Empire. I scrolled briefly through the recent messages. Just an hour earlier, Jada had posted a collage of designer swimsuits she had supposedly just purchased for the trip, followed by a message from my mother gushing about how much fun they were going to have with the grandchildren. They were reveling in their exclusive little club, entirely funded by the scapegoat they had left behind. I tapped the text box. I did not write a paragraph explaining my feelings. I did not demand an apology. I did not engage in the emotional theatrics they usually use to manipulate me. I typed 4 simple words: pay without me. I hit send. I locked my phone, placed it face down on my desk, and turned my attention back to my client reports. I knew the exact sequence of events that would follow. The travel agent would swipe the card again. The terminal would beep, displaying a harsh, undeniable declined message. My father would laugh it off at first, blaming a bank error, and ask them to run it one more time. The agent, perhaps growing slightly impatient or embarrassed on his behalf, would try again with the same result. The realization would slowly creep in. Exactly 10 minutes later, my phone shattered the quiet atmosphere of my office. The screen lit up violently with Desmond's name flashing across the display. He was calling repeatedly. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deep breath before I finally answered. I did not even get the chance to say hello. The sound of my father screaming in a blind, breathless panic exploded through the speaker. He was practically hyperventilating, his voice a chaotic mixture of rage and profound humiliation. "Kendra, what did you do?" he bellowed, his voice echoing slightly, indicating he was likely pacing in the lobby of the travel agency. "What is wrong with the card? Tell your bank to fix this right now. Do you hear me right now?" I could hear the ambient noise of the upscale travel office in the background. I could hear the hushed, uncomfortable murmurs of the staff and the other wealthy patrons who were witnessing the great Desmond completely lose his composure. My father was a man who lived and died by public perception. Being publicly declined for a luxury vacation package in front of his peers was his absolute worst nightmare. He was stripped of his armor, exposed as a man spending money he did not actually have. "There is nothing wrong with the bank, Dad," I replied, my voice dangerously soft and even. "The account is frozen. I revoked your access, all of you." The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second, as the reality of my words penetrated his panic. Then the silence morphed into a new, darker level of fury. He demanded that I unblock the card immediately. He tried to use his booming, authoritative tone, the one he had used since I was a child, to force me into submission. He cited family respect. He told me I was embarrassing him, that I was acting like a petulant, spoiled child throwing a tantrum. When his demands did not elicit an immediate apology from me, he resorted to his favorite weapon. He threatened me. He told me that if I did not call the bank right that second and authorize the payment, he would disown me. He swore that I would no longer be welcome in his house, that I would be cut out of the family entirely, and that I would regret treating my own blood with such deep disrespect. I sat back in my leather executive chair and looked out over the sprawling city. I felt an overwhelming wave of liberation wash over my entire body. He was threatening to take away a family that had never truly claimed me in the first place. He was threatening to revoke my membership to a club that only valued me when the bill arrived. I let him finish his tirade. I let him scream until his voice cracked with the strain of his own manufactured authority. When he finally paused to catch his breath, demanding my compliance one last time, I leaned into the microphone of my phone. "I cannot," I said, my tone perfectly devoid of any emotion. "The card is only for family, and according to you, I do not qualify." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off whatever desperate, enraged response he was about to hurl at me. The silence in my office returned, but it was no longer a heavy, burdened silence. It was the clear, sharp quiet of a slate being wiped completely clean. I tossed my phone onto the desk. Less than 30 seconds later, the screen illuminated again, accompanied by the sharp, repetitive chime of incoming text messages. It was not my father this time. The name Yvonne flashed across the glass. My mother had joined the battlefield. The vicious, frantic energy of her first message preview glowing on my screen told me everything I needed to know. The panic had officially set in, and the true colors of my family were about to be put on full, undeniable display. My phone lit up again almost before I could even set it down. The screen flashed with the name Yvonne. My mother was calling. I did not answer. I sat back in my leather chair, watching the device vibrate across the polished surface of my desk, listening to the harsh, rhythmic buzzing sound. When the call finally went to voicemail, another immediately took its place. She called 3 times back to back before she finally realized I was not going to pick up and switched her tactics. The voicemail notification chimed. I put the phone on speaker and tapped play, leaning back with my hands steepled together. My mother's voice filled my quiet office, trembling with a manufactured theatrical rage. "Kendra, you need to call the bank and fix this immediately," she demanded, skipping any form of greeting. "Your father is standing in the middle of Azure Travel looking like an absolute fool in front of the entire agency. You are throwing a tantrum over a simple misunderstanding. Jada has been so stressed with the kids, and Garrett works incredibly hard for this family. They deserve this vacation. You are acting out of pure jealousy because your sister has a beautiful marriage and you have nothing but your bank accounts. Turn the card back on right now before you ruin your sister's trip permanently. I let the message play out to the end. The sheer audacity of her words washed over me. But instead of the familiar sting of rejection I had felt for the past 3 decades, I felt absolutely nothing. For years, a voicemail like that would have sent me into a spiral of guilt. I would have scrambled to fix the problem, desperate to buy back her conditional affection, desperate to prove I was not the bitter, jealous spinster she constantly accused me of being. But today, her words were just empty noise. She was deploying her usual emotional bait, throwing Jada's marriage in my face to trigger my deepest insecurities. It was a tired playbook, and I was no longer playing the game. I deleted the voicemail. I did not text her back. I did not offer an explanation or an apology. Instead, I opened my laptop and initiated a video call with my lead corporate attorney, an aggressive, brilliant legal mind named Jonathan, who had helped me structure my initial investments years ago. When Jonathan's face appeared on my screen, I did not waste time with small talk. I told him I needed to completely and permanently detach my personal wealth, my credit lines, and my trust assets from my father's real estate brokerage. I explained that I was no longer acting as the financial guarantor for his business. The safety net was officially gone. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sudden drastic move, but he did not question my judgment. He knew the numbers better than anyone. He knew that my father's brokerage had been operating in the red for over 2 years, and that my capital was the only thing keeping the lights on in their commercial building. I instructed Jonathan to begin drafting the legal notices immediately. I also told him it was time to call in a massive favor with my contacts at the regional bank to ensure the separation of assets was expedited without any bureaucratic delays. We needed to formally initiate the paperwork to withdraw my surety bond by the end of the business day. As Jonathan and I finalized the legal strategy, my phone vibrated with a social media notification. I normally kept my personal notifications muted during work hours, but the algorithms knew exactly who I was connected to. It was an update from Jada. I opened the application to find a newly posted picture on her timeline. It was a flawlessly filtered, professionally staged photograph of her and Garrett. They were standing on the grand staircase of my parents' estate, dressed in matching designer resort wear, looking like the absolute picture of affluent, carefree bliss. Garrett had his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, and Jada was flashing her signature practiced smile. It was the caption, however, that truly highlighted her breathtaking entitlement. She had written a lengthy paragraph about the importance of protecting your peace and surrounding yourself with positive energy. The final sentence was a thinly veiled, deeply passive, aggressive attack aimed directly at me. She wrote that she was praying for selfish, bitter, unmarried women trying to ruin family joy just because they are unhappy with their own lonely lives. I read the caption twice, a genuine dark laugh escaping my lips. The absolute irony was almost poetic. Jada was standing on a staircase that I paid the mortgage for, wearing clothes bought with a credit card that bore my name, preparing for a vacation that I had financed while publicly calling me selfish and bitter. She truly believed that the money flowing into her life was a divine right, completely disconnected from the sister she so casually stepped on to elevate herself. She relied entirely on my silent financial backing to maintain her lifestyle, yet she was bold enough to bite the hand that fed her in front of her entire elite social circle. I did not leave a comment. I did not report the post or block her account. Let her enjoy her digital validation. Let her soak up the sympathetic comments from her friends praising her strength and her beautiful family. Her reality was about to come crashing down in a way a social media filter could never fix. Finalizing the legal detachment of my assets required a comprehensive audit of the current corporate accounts. As the primary guarantor and a legal stakeholder in my father's business, I had master administrative access to the company's back-end financial ledgers. I had never closely scrutinized the day-to-day operational expenses of the brokerage before. I had trusted my father to handle the micromanagement of his own firm, stepping in only to provide macro-level liquidity when he requested it. That blind trust was a mistake I was about to rectify. I logged into the secure internal server using my credentials. The dashboard loaded, displaying the grim reality of the brokerage's cash flow. I started pulling the detailed expense reports, cross-referencing the outgoing wire transfers with the operational budget. I decided to start my audit by looking into the department managed by my golden brother-in-law. Garrett held the title of Vice President of Business Development, a role my father had essentially invented for him after Jada begged for her husband to be brought into the family business. I filtered the search parameters to isolate all transactions approved by Garrett over the past 24 months. The screen populated with hundreds of line items. At first glance, they appeared to be standard operational costs. There were consulting fees, marketing retainers, and vendor payouts. But as I drilled down into the specific invoices, my eyes narrowed. I opened a file containing a series of recurring monthly payments to a third-party logistics consulting firm. The amounts were staggering, consistently hovering around $20,000 a month. The invoices were vague, lacking any specific deliverables or detailed descriptions of the services provided. I cross-referenced the name of the consulting firm with the State Business Registry database. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. The consulting firm was a shell company, and the registered agent for that shell company was a limited liability corporation filed under Garrett's personal name. I sat forward, my heart pounding with a dangerous, thrilling rhythm. I pulled up another invoice and then another. The pattern was undeniable. He was charging the brokerage for non-existent services, authorizing the payments himself, and routing the money straight into his own pockets. Jada was entirely unaware that by forcing me to cut financial ties, she had pushed me to open the books. I now had full, unrestricted access to the company's deepest, darkest financial secrets. I stared at the glowing screen, the undeniable proof of massive systematic theft staring back at me. My father had tossed me aside to protect a man who was actively robbing him blind. The hooks were set, the trap was loaded, and I was holding the match that was going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. I knew I had struck a goldmine of corruption, but I also knew that uncovering financial crimes was not a solo endeavor. I needed airtight proof. I needed a paper trail so undeniable that not even my father's legendary ego could blind him to the truth. I picked up my phone and dialed the one person I trusted with this kind of explosive information. Malik had been my closest friend since our freshman year at Howard University. Today, he was one of the most ruthless forensic accountants in the Southeast. He had a reputation for tearing apart corporate ledgers and finding every buried cent. Malik walked into my executive suite less than 40 minutes after I called him. He took one look at my face, set his briefcase on the leather sofa, and pulled up a chair next to my desk. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I turned my monitor toward him and showed him the shell company registrations I had just linked to Garrett. Malik leaned forward, his eyes scanning the digital invoices. The silence in the office was thick as he digested the information. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You mean to tell me," he said, his voice laced with disgust, "that your father has been treating you like a second-class citizen at Sunday dinner, while his golden white son-in-law has his hand buried up to the elbow in the company cookie jar?" "Exactly," I replied. Desmond was so busy making sure I knew my place that he handed the keys to the kingdom to a man who is actively dismantling it. But I need to know how deep the rot goes. I need you to track every single wire transfer, every phantom consulting fee, and every inflated vendor invoice. I want to know exactly how much of my money Garrett has stolen. Malik cracked his knuckles, a predatory smile crossing his face. "Give me master access," he said. "Give me 2 hours. I will give you a financial autopsy so thorough it will make his head spin." I handed my keyboard over to Malik and moved to the small sitting area in my office, opening my secondary laptop to continue managing my actual clients. The steady clicking of Malik's typing filled the room. For the next hour, the only sounds were his occasional sighs of disbelief and the quiet hum of the city traffic far below my windows. As I watched him work, the profound irony of the situation settled over me. My parents had spent my entire life elevating my sister. Jada was the beauty queen, the socialite, the woman who had secured her status by marrying Garrett. Garrett was supposed to be the brilliant business mind, the man who would take my father's real estate brokerage to the next level. Meanwhile, I was just the workaholic spinster who was expected to silently fund their delusions of grandeur. They had weaponized my single status to justify treating me like an outsider, all while siphoning the wealth I generated to pay for their matching luxury vehicles and their trips to Cabo. Kendra Malik said, suddenly breaking my train of thought. He swiveled the monitor back toward me. The spreadsheet he had generated was color-coded and staggering. It is worse than you thought. He is not just skimming off the top. He has set up 3 different dummy corporations. He is billing the brokerage for marketing campaigns that never happened, property staging services that do not exist, and legal retainers for firms that are not registered in the state of Georgia. I stared at the total sum highlighted in bold red at the bottom of the screen. Garrett had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 2 years. The brokerage was not just struggling due to a shifting real estate market. It was bleeding out because the vice president of business development was severing its major arteries. And the worst part, Malik added, leaning back and crossing his arms, is that he is sloppy. He did not even try to hide his digital footprint. He used the same IP address to register the shell companies that he uses to log into the brokerage server. He assumed nobody would ever check. He assumed your father was too arrogant to audit him, and he assumed you would just keep blindly paying the credit card bills to keep the peace. He underestimated me, I said quietly, feeling a cold, hard knot of resolve solidify in my chest. They all did. Before Malik could explain the next phase of the offshore routing, he had discovered the sharp, urgent ringing of my desk phone shattered the quiet concentration of the room. It was the internal line from the security desk in the main lobby of my building. I picked up the receiver. It was Thomas, the head of daytime security. "Ms. Williams," he said, his voice tense and rushed. "I am so sorry to interrupt you, but we have a situation down here. 2 women just bypassed the guest sign-in desk. They ignored my officers and slipped into the executive elevator by tailgating a group of partners returning from lunch. They are on their way up to your floor right now. They claim to be your mother and sister, and they are causing quite a disturbance." My grip on the phone tightened. The absolute audacity of these women knew no bounds. My financial firm was highly secure, a place of quiet professionalism and elite wealth management. The fact that Yvonne and Jada felt entitled enough to storm past security protocols and force their way into my workplace told me everything I needed to know about their complete lack of boundaries. They did not view me as a respected executive. They still viewed me as the family scapegoat, a subordinate they could corner and bully into submission. "Do not call the police yet, Thomas," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Send 2 of your biggest officers up to the 54th floor immediately. I want them waiting by the elevator banks. I will handle this, but I want them ready to escort these women out of the building." I hung up the phone and looked at Malik. "Save everything to the encrypted drive and lock the screen," I instructed. "The rats are out of the maze." Malik quickly hit a series of keystrokes, the glowing spreadsheets vanishing behind a secure password prompt. He stood up, smoothing his tie, his expression shifting from forensic accountant to protective friend. "Do you want me to step out?" he asked. "No," I replied, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my tailored suit. "I want you to sit right there and witness exactly why I am burning this bridge to ash." I walked around my desk and positioned myself in the center of my office. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my suite, I had a clear view of the reception area and the polished silver doors of the private executive elevators. The quiet murmur of my staff working in the adjacent bullpens suddenly ceased. The atmosphere in the office shifted from productive energy to tense anticipation. My employees were highly trained professionals, but they could sense when a storm was about to hit. A soft chime echoed through the reception area, signaling the arrival of the elevator. The heavy metal doors slid open. My mother, Yvonne, marched out first. She was dressed in her typical Sunday best, a designer tweed suit, and a string of pearls that I had purchased for her 50th birthday. Her face was flushed dark with a mixture of exertion and unhinged rage. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor, sounding like gunshots in the quiet office. Jada was right behind her, clutching her expensive handbag like a shield, looking equally furious but hiding safely behind our mother's aggressive bravado. They did not stop at the receptionist's desk. They did not ask if I was available. Yvonne locked eyes with me through the glass walls of my office and stormed directly toward my door, completely ignoring the shocked stares of my staff. She pushed the heavy glass door open without knocking, the hinges groaning slightly under the force. She stepped into my sanctuary, her chest heaving, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. Kendra Yvonne shouted, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of any professional decorum, carrying easily out into the open floor plan of my firm. You are going to pick up that phone, call your bank, and turn our credit lines back on this instant. If you do not fix this mess right now, I swear to God I will ruin your career and drag your name through the mud until you have nothing left. I sat perfectly still behind my desk, letting the echo of her shrieking voice bounce off the acoustic glass of my office walls. My mother stood there, panting, her face a mask of furious entitlement. She truly believed that storming into my workplace and throwing a tantrum would force me back into submission. Beside her, Jada gripped her designer handbag, a bag I had undoubtedly paid for, looking both terrified and emboldened by our mother's aggressive entry. You are going to pick up that phone, Yvonne repeated, her voice dripping with venom. You are going to fix this. You have humiliated your father. You have humiliated Garrett. You are acting like a bitter, jealous child, and I will not allow you to ruin this family vacation over your petty insecurities. I did not reach for the phone. I did not break eye contact. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the two women who had spent my entire life making me feel like a second-class citizen. I let the silence stretch between us. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that forced them to realize I was not intimidated. I was not the little girl they could bully anymore. I was a senior wealth manager sitting in an executive suite that I had earned through blood, sweat, and relentless dedication. Malik sat perfectly still on the leather sofa, his forensic accounting laptop closed securely on his lap. He watched the exchange with the sharp, observant eyes of a man who dealt with corporate fraud for a living. He recognized the desperation rolling off my mother in waves. She was not angry about a vacation. She was terrified that the financial dam had finally broken. You can scream all you want, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and completely even. My tone was the exact opposite of her hysterical shouting, and I saw it throw her off balance. You can threaten to ruin my career. You can threaten to drag my name through the mud. But the simple, undeniable fact is that you have no power here. The corporate accounts are permanently frozen. The credit lines are closed. You will not spend another dime of my money. Jada stepped forward, finding her false courage. You have no right to do this, Kendra. Garrett has been working himself to the bone for that brokerage. He deserves a break. We need that vacation. You are just doing this because you are miserable and alone. You want everyone else to be as miserable as you are. A short, dark laugh escaped my throat. I glanced at Malik, thinking about the massive embezzlement file currently locked on his hard drive. Garrett was certainly working hard, just not in the way Jada thought. But I was not going to drop that nuclear bomb just yet. I needed them to hang themselves with their own rope first. I am not miserable, Jada, I replied, standing up slowly. I placed both hands flat on my desk. I am actually feeling fantastic. What I am not feeling is generous. You two came into my place of business, bypassed my security, and decided to throw a fit because I cut off your allowance. You are 37 years old, Jada. It is time to pay for your own beachside cabanas. Yvonne slammed her hands down on the back of the guest chair, her face contorting with fresh fury. How dare you speak to your sister that way, she spat. How dare you speak to me that way? After everything we have done for you, after all the sacrifices we made to ensure you had a good life, we sacrificed our own comfort to put you through college. We paid your way through that HBCU, and this is the gratitude you show us. You are a selfish, ungrateful daughter. The absolute audacity of her lie hit me like a physical blow. She was banking on the idea that if she screamed her lies loud enough, my staff would hear them and judge me. She wanted to publicly shame me into compliance. I saw several of my junior analysts in the bullpen outside my glass walls exchanging wide-eyed glances. They were pretending to type, but they were hanging onto every single word. If she wanted a public scene, I was more than happy to oblige. I walked around my desk, closing the physical distance between us. I did not lower my voice this time. I made sure every single syllable carried through the glass and out into the open floor plan. "You sacrificed nothing for my education," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute undeniable authority. "Do not stand in my office and lie to my face. I went to Howard University on a full academic scholarship. I paid for my own textbooks by working night shifts. I earned my degrees with zero financial help from you or Desmond." Yvonne opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off, my voice rising to dominate the space. "But since we are talking about educational sacrifices, let us tell the whole truth. Let us talk about how you and Desmond drained your savings to pay for Jada's 3 separate failed attempts at a marketing degree. Let us talk about how you funded her lifestyle while she dropped out over and over again." Jada's face turned a blotchy mottled red. She took a step back, suddenly looking very small. "You leave my education out of this," she stammered, her voice shaking. "I am not finished." I continued, my gaze locking onto my mother, refusing to let her look away. "You want to talk about gratitude. You want to talk about who sacrifices for who. Let us talk about your beautiful estate in the suburbs. The one you love to host your church group in. The one you pretend is completely paid off. Who do you think has been quietly paying the second mortgage on that property for the last 3 years?" Yvonne froze, the color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. Jada's head whipped around to stare at our mother, her eyes wide with genuine shock. "That is right," I said, driving the truth home like a nail into a coffin. "While you were busy telling your friends that I was a bitter spinster, I was the one wiring thousands of dollars every month to keep the bank from foreclosing on your house. I am the reason you have a roof over your head. I am the reason Desmond's brokerage has not collapsed. And I am the reason you had those black cards in your wallets. You do not support me. I sponsor you." The silence that followed was absolute. The entire floor of my firm was dead quiet. Yvonne stood there, her mouth slightly open, completely stripped of her matriarchal armor. The illusion of her generational wealth had just been publicly shattered by the daughter she despised. She had no defense. She had no counter-argument. She was completely, utterly exposed. Just then, the heavy glass door of my office swung open wider. 2 large, broad-shouldered security guards stepped into the room, their faces set in grim professional lines. Thomas, the head of daytime security, stood just behind them. "Ms. Williams," one of the guards said, keeping a respectful distance, "do you need these individuals escorted from the premises?" I looked at my mother and my sister. They looked like strangers to me. The familial bond had been entirely dissolved, replaced by a cold, calculating business transaction. They had forced my hand, and now they were going to deal with the consequences of an audit. "Yes," I replied, my voice returning to its calm, professional baseline. "They are trespassing. Please escort them down to the lobby and ensure their names are permanently added to the building block list. They are never to be allowed past the front desk again." Yvonne bristled, trying to muster one last shred of her dignity. "You cannot do this, Kendra. We are your family. You will regret treating your own blood like this." The guards moved forward, flanking the 2 women, and gesturing firmly toward the open door. "It is time to leave, ladies." The taller guard commanded his tone, leaving no room for negotiation. Jada grabbed her mother's arm, pulling her toward the exit. "Let us go, Mom!" Jada hissed, her face burning with humiliation. "Everyone is staring at us. She is crazy. Just leave it." They turned and began walking out of my office, guided firmly by the security detail. They moved past the reception desk, heading straight for the executive elevators. I watched them walk away, feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I had stood my ground. I had protected my sanctuary. But I was not quite finished. There was one final piece of business to attend to. I turned back to my desk and picked up a thick, heavy manila envelope that I had printed and prepared just an hour earlier. I walked out of my office following them to the elevator bank. The polished metal doors slid open, and the guards directed my mother and sister inside. Before the doors could close, I stepped forward and held out my hand, stopping the censor. I looked directly at Yvonne. She glared back at me, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and fear. I held out the manila envelope. She did not reach for it, so I simply tossed it. It landed with a heavy thud on the floor of the elevator car, right at the tips of her designer shoes. "What is this?" Yvonne demanded, looking down at the package as if it were a bomb. "That is a formal, legally binding demand letter drafted by my attorneys," I said, stepping back so the doors could begin their closing sequence. "It dictates the immediate repayment of the $150,000 in personal loans I fronted Desmond's business over the last 2 years. You have exactly 30 days to liquidate your assets and return my money in full. If the funds are not wired to my trust account by the deadline, I will place a lien on your estate and drag you through civil court." Yvonne's eyes widened in absolute terror. The bravado completely vanished, replaced by the crushing realization that I was executing a hostile financial takeover of their lives. "Kendra, you cannot be serious," she gasped, stepping forward, but the heavy metal doors were already sliding shut. "I am deadly serious," I replied, my voice cutting through the narrowing gap between the doors. "Enjoy your vacation." The elevator doors locked together with a firm, satisfying click, sealing them inside and sending them down to the street level. I stood in the quiet lobby for a moment, the weight of the last 10 minutes settling over me. I turned around and walked back toward my office. My staff immediately returned to their keyboards, but I could feel the newfound respect radiating through the room. I had just drawn a massive, uncrossable boundary. The war had officially begun, and I was going to win. The rest of the afternoon passed with a surreal quiet. My staff was respectful, giving me space, but the energy in the firm was electric. I finished my client portfolios, packed my briefcase, and took my private elevator down to the parking garage. The drive back to my Buckhead penthouse was peaceful. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet and watched the city lights flicker to life through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I knew the calm would not last long, and I was entirely prepared for the retaliation. At exactly 8:15, my laptop chimed with a high-priority email notification. The sender was Garrett. I opened the message and took a slow sip of my wine. The subject line read, "Official notice of cease and desist," in bold capitalized letters. The body of the email was a masterpiece of unearned arrogance. Garrett had clearly spent the last few hours desperately searching the internet for legal terminology, trying to piece together a message that sounded intimidating. He accused me of corporate sabotage, fiduciary interference, and outright extortion. He claimed that my formal demand for the $150,000 loan repayment was a malicious, unprovoked attack on my father's business. He ended the rambling email with a hard ultimatum, stating that if I did not formally retract the demand by 9 o'clock the next morning, he would personally initiate a massive civil lawsuit against me for embezzlement and seek to have my professional licenses revoked. I actually laughed out loud. The sound echoed in my empty, immaculate living room. The sheer blinding audacity of this man was almost impressive. Here was a painfully mediocre white man who had failed upward his entire life, a man who only held a vice president title because he married my sister, attempting to legally intimidate a self-made black female financial executive out of her own capital. He was trying to lecture me on corporate finance law using words he clearly did not know how to spell correctly. It was like a toddler trying to explain quantum physics to a nuclear scientist. I read through his threats a second time, analyzing his words not as a sister-in-law, but as a wealth manager. Beneath the aggressive posturing and the ridiculous legal jargon, I could smell the absolute suffocating panic. Garrett was not writing this to protect my father or to defend the honor of the family business. He was terrified. My demand for repayment meant the books would have to be formally opened and officially audited by external accountants. He knew the money was not there to pay me back, and he knew an audit would expose exactly why the accounts were empty. I did not reply to his email. Engaging with a narcissist who is backed into a corner only gives them the validation they are frantically seeking. Instead, I forwarded the entire message directly to Malik with a brief note attached. I told him to focus his entire investigation specifically on the Vice President of Business Development. I instructed him to ignore the standard operational costs and look directly for offshore routing and duplicate vendor payments. While I was typing the message to Malik, a secondary notification popped up on my screen. It was an automated security alert from the real estate brokerage's internal server. The system administrator, undoubtedly acting under frantic screaming orders from my father, was attempting to revoke my master access credentials. They were trying to lock me out of the financial archives to prevent me from seeing the damage. I smiled, taking another sip of my wine and closing my laptop. They were about 12 hours too late. I had already pulled a complete mirror image of their financial history during my meeting with Malik earlier that afternoon. I had the last 7 years of their general ledgers, vendor contracts, employee payroll, and tax filings safely secured on a military-grade encrypted hard drive sitting right on my kitchen counter. Let Desmond change all the passwords and lock the administrative gates. He was just locking the barn door long after the horses had already bolted. The hours ticked by. I tried to go to bed around midnight, but my mind was racing with variables, projections, and legal strategies. I lay in the dark listening to the faint hum of the city outside. I knew my family was likely awake too, huddled in their suburban estate, furiously trying to figure out how to force me back into my designated role as their silent sponsor. They still thought this was just a petty family dispute over a vacation and some hurt feelings. They believed a stern email from Garrett and a server lockout would put me back in my place. They had no idea I was preparing to systematically dismantle their entire reality. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated violently on my nightstand. The harsh buzzing cut through the quiet of my bedroom. The caller identification showed Malik's name. Forensic accountants do not call at 2 in the morning to share mild discrepancies. They call at that hour when they have found a smoking gun. I sat up in bed, turned on the bedside lamp, and answered the call. Malik did not bother saying hello. His voice was dead serious, completely stripped of his usual sarcastic, easygoing charm. "Kendra," he said, his breath hitching slightly over the line. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You need to brace yourself for this." "What did you find?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "This is not just a case of bad bookkeeping or your brother-in-law skimming off the top to pay for luxury cars and vacations," Malik said, the rapid clicking of his keyboard audible in the background. "I have been tracking the vendor payouts for the last 6 hours. I dug past the domestic accounts and started tracing the routing numbers on those phantom consulting fees. I found a web of offshore wire transfers routed through the Cayman Islands and Delaware. He has established a highly sophisticated network of shell companies." I felt a chill run down my spine. The magnitude of what Malik was saying shifted the entire landscape of my retaliation. Garrett is not just stealing a few $1,000s here and there. Malik continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He is committing massive, systematic federal wire fraud. He is bleeding your father's company completely dry. I am looking at millions of dollars unaccounted for over the last 36 months. Kendra, if the authorities look at these ledgers, this goes way beyond a civil lawsuit for repayment. Somebody is going to federal prison. The backlash did not come in the form of a legal response. It came in whispers. When narcissists realize they can no longer control you financially, their immediate reflex is to control how everyone else perceives you. My mother and sister realized they were completely outmatched in a legal battle, so they retreated to the only battlefield where they still held any power. Atlanta High Society. Yvonne was a staple at our local megachurch, a woman who treated Sunday service like an aggressive networking event. Jada was deeply entrenched in her local sorority alumni chapter. Within 48 hours of my security team escorting them out of my office, a highly coordinated and vicious smear campaign was sweeping through the city. I started noticing the shift by the weekend. My phone, usually buzzing with invitations to charity galas and brunch dates, went completely dead silent. The few text messages I did receive were from peripheral acquaintances asking vague and probing questions under the guise of concern. The narrative Yvonne and Jada had spun was equal parts brilliant and pathetic. They painted me as a rogue, mentally unstable spinster who had finally snapped under the pressure of my high-stress career and my lonely personal life. According to my mother's tearful accounts to the church elders, I had not loaned my father's business money. Instead, she claimed I had stolen corporate funds, manipulated the family accounts, and was now trying to extort my own parents to fund a lavish and empty lifestyle. Jada fed her sorority sisters a tragic story about how I was desperately jealous of her picture-perfect marriage to Garrett. She claimed my demand for repayment was just a bitter attempt to ruin her loving family. They played the victims flawlessly. They weaponized my single status, using it as proof of my supposed bitterness. In their version of reality, the successful black woman was just a sad and angry stereotype trying to tear down a loving family out of pure spite. The true depth of the social isolation hit me on a Thursday afternoon. I was scheduled to attend a highly exclusive black business luncheon in Buckhead. It was an event I attended every year, a place where I usually connected with major clients and industry peers. I walked into the ballroom wearing a flawless, tailored suit, projecting the exact same quiet confidence I always did. But the atmosphere was instantly suffocating. Women I had known since childhood, women whose business ventures I had personally helped finance, actively turned their backs as I approached. I watched as a group of prominent real estate agents, close friends of my father, completely disbanded their circle the second I stepped near their table. The polite smiles were gone. The warm greetings were replaced by icy stares and hushed aggressive whispers behind manicured hands. I sat at my designated table completely alone. For a brief and fleeting second, the old childhood wounds flared up in my chest. I felt that familiar heavy feeling of being the outcast, the ugly duckling, the eternal disappointment. They were trying to break my spirit by stripping away my community. They wanted me to feel so isolated and so universally despised that I would come crawling back begging for their forgiveness and withdrawing the legal demand just to regain my social standing. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and looked around the grand room. I did not shrink into my chair. I did not rush out of the ballroom in tears. I simply sat up straighter. I realized that the people shunning me were not my true friends. They were simply an audience that Yvonne and Desmond had bought and paid for over the years. If their loyalty could be swayed with a few tearful lies from my mother, then their loyalty was entirely worthless to me. I stayed for the entire luncheon. I ate my meal. I tipped the waitstaff generously. I walked out of that ballroom with my head held incredibly high, leaving a thick trail of uncomfortable silence in my wake. When I got back to my car, I opened my phone. The social media notifications were piling up. There were passive-aggressive quotes about family betrayal, veiled insults about greedy women, and public prayers for my supposed mental breakdown. I did not type out an angry response. I did not post a long video defending my character. I did not engage in the digital warfare they were so desperately trying to provoke. I deleted the social media applications from my phone entirely. Let them talk. Let them spin their fairy tales. Let Yvonne cry in the church pews. And let Jada play the victim at her luxury brunch dates. I do not deal in gossip. I deal in hard and undeniable facts. And the facts do not care about social standing. I drove straight back to my penthouse. I needed a clear head free from the toxic noise of Atlanta society. I changed into comfortable clothes, poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, and sat at my kitchen island. I had built a fortress of absolute silence. They were shouting into the void, waiting for an emotional reaction that was never going to come. At exactly 6 o'clock that evening, the secure elevator chime echoed through my penthouse. I had authorized the front desk to send my guests straight up. Malik stepped out of the elevator carrying a thick and heavy leather briefcase. He looked completely exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes and his tie was pulled loose, but there was a sharp and dangerous gleam in his expression. It was the look of a hunter who had just cornered his prey. I did not say a word as he walked into my kitchen and set the briefcase down on the marble island. He popped the latches and pulled out a massive stack of printed documents bound in a thick black folder. He slid it across the cool stone surface until it rested right in front of me. I told him I ignored all the whispers today because I knew he was going to bring me something much louder. Malik let out a short and humorless laugh. He leaned against the counter, running a hand over his face. He told me I had no idea how deep the rot went. He had spent the last 48 hours tearing through every single encrypted file, every offshore routing number, and every fake vendor invoice. Garrett did not just skim off the top. He practically took a chainsaw to the financial foundation of my father's brokerage. I placed my hand flat on top of the black folder and asked if the paper trail was finalized. Malik confirmed that it was unredacted, undeniable, and completely damning. His voice was deadly serious. He had tracked the stolen money all the way to a series of blind trusts in the Cayman Islands. We were looking at over $2.5 million systematically drained from my father's operational reserves over the last 36 months. Garrett had used the real estate brokerage as his own personal piggy bank to fund a shell company he completely controlled. My father was about to lose everything he had ever built, and the white son-in-law he praised at the Sunday dinner table was the one holding the match. I opened the cover of the report. The very first page was a detailed summary of wire transfers, each one bearing Garrett's digital authorization signature. The evidence was absolute. It was a masterpiece of corporate theft, and it was sitting right in the palm of my hands. I closed the folder and looked up at Malik. The smear campaign did not matter anymore. The isolation did not matter. My family had handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute a flawless and catastrophic destruction of their entire false reality. I closed the folder and looked up at Malik. The smear campaign did not matter anymore. The isolation did not matter. My family had handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute a flawless and catastrophic destruction of their entire false reality. I asked Malik to walk me through the exact anatomy of the theft. I needed to understand every single moving part of Garrett's embezzlement scheme. Malik opened his laptop again, his fingers flying across the keys as he projected his screen onto the large smart television mounted on my living room wall. The visual representation of the fraud was even more staggering than the printed summary. Malik explained that Garrett had started small. Shortly after marrying Jada and being appointed vice president of business development, he set up a domestic limited liability company under a generic name like Apex Strategic Solutions. He initially billed the real estate brokerage for minor consulting fees, things ranging from $5,000 to $8,000 a month. Because my father, Desmond, was notoriously technologically illiterate and preferred to handle big-picture networking rather than granular accounting, these initial invoices slipped right through the cracks. The accounting department, assuming the boss's new son-in-law had full authorization, simply processed the payments. But greed is a hungry beast. Once Garrett realized nobody was actually checking his work, he escalated the operation. Malik pulled up a specific transaction from 14 months ago. It was a wire transfer for $85,000, categorized under the vague heading of Regional Market Expansion Research. Malik then traced that exact amount. The money left Desmond's brokerage, landed in the Apex Strategic Solutions account, and within 48 hours, it was wired to an offshore trust account registered in the Cayman Islands. I sat at my kitchen island sipping my coffee, feeling a sharp, biting sense of irony wash over me. The cultural and familial implications of what I was looking at were almost too perfect. My father was a proud, boastful man who loved to present himself as a pillar of black excellence in Atlanta. He built his brokerage from the ground up, fighting through decades of systemic barriers to establish a name for himself. Yet, his internalized prejudices and his desperate need for elite validation had become his fatal blind spot. When his own black daughter achieved massive success in the financial sector, he viewed me not as an asset but as a threat to his ego. He needed to diminish me, to mock my single status, to keep me in my place so he could feel superior. But when Jada brought home Garrett, a mediocre white man with a smooth golf swing and a vocabulary full of empty corporate buzzwords, Desmond handed him the keys to the empire without a second thought. Desmond trusted Garrett implicitly because Garrett looked like the traditional old money establishment Desmond was so desperate to impress. And Garrett had used that exact privilege to rob my father completely blind. I thought about my sister Jada. I thought about her cruel laughter at the dinner table and her passive-aggressive social media posts. She strutted around the city dripping in designer labels, convinced she had won the ultimate prize. She looked down on me for being unmarried, believing her marital status elevated her above my hard-earned wealth. She had no idea that her perfect loving husband was systematically draining her future inheritance to fund a secret life she knew nothing about. The sheer delusion of her arrogance was staggering. I looked back at the screen. "How long do they have?" I asked Malik. "How long until the brokerage completely defaults?" Malik did not even need to calculate the numbers. He looked at me with a grim, serious expression. "If you had not frozen that corporate black card, they might have limped along for another 2 or 3 months, just floating the operational costs on your credit limit. But since you cut the lifeline, the reality of their cash flow is going to hit them immediately. They are running on fumes. Based on the upcoming payroll projections and their commercial lease obligations, Desmond's company is going to be completely insolvent in less than 3 weeks. When the first of the month hits, checks are going to start bouncing." The magnitude of the situation settled heavily into the quiet space of my penthouse. Initially, my plan had been relatively simple. I wanted to force them to repay the $150,000 loan I had fronted the business, detach my assets, and walk away. But looking at the massive scale of Garrett's theft, I realized that demanding my money back was no longer enough. If I simply filed a civil lawsuit for my loan, Desmond would never admit the truth. His ego could not handle the public humiliation of admitting his golden son-in-law had scammed him. He would file for bankruptcy, sweep Garrett's crimes under the rug to protect Jada's marriage, and spend the rest of his life telling the Atlanta high society that his cruel, bitter daughter deliberately bankrupted the family business out of spite. He would make me the villain of his story forever. I could not allow that to happen. I refused to let them control the narrative anymore. I realized in that moment that I did not just want my money back. I wanted to completely and permanently dismantle the false empire they used to abuse me. I wanted to expose the truth so widely and so undeniably that no amount of church gossip or sorority whispers could ever put their pristine image back together. I turned to Malik. "I need you to finalize this report. I want it ironclad. I want every single offshore transfer, every fake invoice, and every digital signature verified and cross-referenced. I want you to bind this evidence into official physical dossiers. Put them in red folders. I want them to stand out. We are not just going to hand this over to a lawyer, we are going to put it on display." Malik smiled, recognizing the shift in my strategy. "You got it," he said, packing up his laptop. "But if you are going to drop a bomb this big, you are going to need a very specific kind of stage. You cannot just do this in a boardroom." He was right. I needed a venue where the audience was guaranteed to be the exact people my parents cared about impressing the most. I needed maximum visibility. After Malik left, I walked toward the entryway of my penthouse to gather my thoughts. I picked up the stack of mail that my building concierge had brought up earlier in the day. I sifted through the generic envelopes and financial publications until my fingers brushed against something heavy and textured. It was a thick, oversized envelope made of premium black cardstock. I turned it over and broke the wax seal. I pulled out an ornate gold-foiled invitation. The elegant cursive font gleamed under the soft lighting of my foyer. It was an exclusive invitation from the local Chamber of Commerce for the upcoming Atlanta Black Business Excellence Gala. This was the social event of the season, a highly anticipated evening where the most prominent politicians, investors, and business leaders in the city gathered to network and celebrate their achievements. I read further down the invitation, my eyes locking onto the honoree section. My breath hitched, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. The universe truly had a remarkable sense of timing. Desmond was listed as the primary honoree of the evening. He was slated to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his outstanding contributions to building generational wealth and fostering economic growth within the community. The breathtaking hypocrisy of honoring a man who financially exploited his black daughter to fund a white embezzler was almost too perfect to articulate. My mother would undoubtedly be wearing a new custom gown for the occasion. Jada would be parading Garrett around the ballroom, posing for photographers and playing the role of the ultimate power couple. Desmond would stand at the podium and deliver a self-congratulatory speech about hard work, family loyalty, and his flawless business acumen. They were planning to host their crowning moment of glory in front of the entire city. I tapped the thick gold-foiled card against the palm of my hand. I had found my stage. I had found the exact location where I was going to tear down their house of cards. But to execute this properly, I could not just show up as an angry daughter with a folder full of accusations. I needed leverage. I needed to walk into that ballroom holding the literal deed to my father's legacy. I needed to own the very ground he was standing on before I pulled the rug out from under him. I walked back into my home office and opened my laptop. I had a massive amount of work to do, and I needed to move with absolute precision. The gala was exactly 2 weeks away. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive and secure the debt. I sat at the family dinner table when my father looked me dead in the eye and announced my luxury vacation ticket was revoked. "It is only for family," he said, "and without a husband or kids, I simply did not qualify." My sister and her husband laughed as they claimed my oceanfront suite. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just quietly walked out. What they conveniently forgot was that the corporate black card funding their entire lavish lifestyle had my name on it. When my father tried to drop $5,000 a few days later, I hit block and sent a 3-word text that shattered his fake empire. The air inside my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate was thick with the smell of smothered pork chops, collard greens, and heavy pretension. It was our usual Sunday family dinner, a ritual I had endured for years out of a misplaced sense of duty. I am Kendra. I am 35 years old, and I work as a senior wealth manager at a top-tier financial firm in the city. My life is a relentless cycle of 60-hour work weeks, analyzing portfolios, managing high-net-worth clients, and building my own independence. I was exhausted running on pure caffeine and the promise of our upcoming luxury family trip to Cabo San Lucas. I had been looking forward to that white sand and blue water for 6 solid months. I pushed my food around my plate, trying to engage in the conversation. I took a sip of my sparkling water and offered a tired but genuine smile. "I cannot wait for our vacation next week," I said, setting my glass down. "I really need to disconnect. 60 hours this week alone has my brain completely fried. Cabo is going to be the perfect reset for all of us." The clinking of silverware against fine bone china stopped. The silence that fell over the dining room was immediate and suffocating. My father, Desmond, a man whose pride was only outmatched by his arrogance, slowly cut a piece of his steak. He did not look up at me. He simply chewed his food, swallowed, and let out a low, mocking laugh that echoed in the cavernous room. "It is only for family." "Kendra," he said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather, rather than cutting me out of a trip I had spent months paying for and planning. "You are not coming. Without you, it will actually be a family trip." I froze. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Across the table, my older sister Jada let out a loud, cruel snort of laughter. Jada was the undisputed golden child of the family. She had failed out of her marketing degree program 3 separate times, but she had managed to marry Garrett, a white man with a supposedly impressive background who fit perfectly into my parents' vision of elevated social status. Garrett leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon, and joined in his wife's laughter. The sound of his smug, entitled chuckle in my parents' dining room grated against my every nerve. I looked toward my mother, expecting some kind of intervention, some baseline level of maternal defense. Yvonne simply adjusted her silk blouse, took a delicate sip of her red wine, and looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. "Be reasonable, Kendra," my mother said smoothly, completely unbothered by the cruelty of the moment. "You are single and childless. Jada and Garrett need the extra space. They need your oceanfront suite for the kids. It just makes more sense. Besides, you would just bring down the mood anyway. You are always so serious and focused on work. A family vacation is for people who have actually built a family." The sheer audacity of her statement felt like a physical blow to my chest. I did not scream. I did not throw my napkin down. I did not burst into tears like the fragile, broken daughter they desperately wanted me to be. Instead, I sat perfectly still and let my eyes wander around the room, taking in the physical evidence of their staggering hypocrisy. I looked down at the massive custom-built mahogany dining table where we were all seated. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that seated 12 people comfortably. My father loved to brag about it to his golf buddies. What he never mentioned was that I was the one who quietly paid for it. When his real estate brokerage missed a crucial quarter 2 years ago, and he was facing the humiliation of downsizing, I was the one who wrote the check to keep his image intact. I looked up at the glittering crystal chandelier hanging above us, another luxury I had funded to maintain the illusion of Desmond's unstoppable success. I went to Howard University on a full academic scholarship because my parents refused to pay my tuition, claiming they needed the funds to support Jada's endless attempts at finding herself. I built my career from the ground up. I earned every promotion, every bonus, every ounce of respect I held in the financial district. I had been paying the second mortgage on this very estate for 3 years, keeping the roof over their heads while they paraded around Atlanta high society. And yet, sitting here I was nothing to them but an ATM they could insult for entertainment. The silence stretched on heavy with their expectation that I would apologize for making things awkward, or perhaps beg to be included, promising to pay for my own separate room. Garrett smirked at me, clearly enjoying the dynamic where the successful black woman was put in her place by her own family. Jada whispered something to him, and they shared another quiet laugh. I slowly reached for my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my untouched plate. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, her voice laced with irritation. "We have not even served dessert yet. Do not be dramatic, Kendra." I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of my anger. I simply looked at my father, who finally raised his eyes to meet mine. I nodded politely, a gesture so cold and detached it made his confident expression waver for just a fraction of a second. "Enjoy your dessert," I said evenly. "And enjoy Cabo." I turned and walked out of the dining room. I retrieved my designer coat from the entryway closet, slipping it on as I opened the heavy front door. I stepped out into the cool Atlanta evening, pulling the door shut behind me with a firm, decisive click. I did not slam it. Slamming it would imply I was out of control. I was entirely in control. I walked down the manicured driveway to my car, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pristine paving stones. I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle, relishing the absolute quiet of the insulated cabin. The engine hummed to life, but I did not put the car in drive right away. I sat there, the streetlights reflecting off my windshield, processing the reality of what had just happened. My family had explicitly told me I meant nothing to them beyond what I could provide. They had drawn their line in the sand. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my secure banking application, bypassing the biometric lock, and navigated to the corporate accounts section. There it was, the exclusive corporate black card, the lifeblood of Desmond's real estate brokerage, and the magical plastic that funded his expensive suits, his lavish dinners, and his upcoming family vacation. The account was entirely under my name. It was backed by my credit, my assets, my hard work. I had set it up years ago as a lifeline when his business was failing, allowing him to save face and pretend he was still the king of his castle. I stared at the screen, watching the numbers reflect a reality my family chose to ignore. My thumb hovered over the settings menu. I navigated to the card management controls. The words "lock account" glowed on the screen. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. They wanted a family vacation without me. They were about to learn exactly how much of their family was built on my back. I thought about Jada packing her designer luggage, preparing to lounge by an infinity pool that I was financing. I thought about Garrett drinking top-shelf liquor on my dime while looking down his nose at me. I thought about my mother, who cared more about the optics of a perfect family photo on a beach than the feelings of her own daughter. And I thought about my father, a man so blinded by his own toxic pride that he believed he could bite the hand that fed him without ever facing starvation. They had demanded I respect their boundaries regarding what constitutes a family. It was only right that I enforce my own boundaries regarding what constitutes my money. The days of silent compliance were over. The days of buying their conditional love were finished. I took one last look at the glowing facade of my parents' estate through my rearview mirror. It looked like a fortress, but I knew it was nothing more than a house of cards, and I was holding the bottom card. My thumb pressed down on the screen. The application processed the request for a brief moment before a green check mark appeared, confirming the action. The corporate account was frozen, the credit line was severed, the financial umbilical cord was officially cut. I put the car in drive and pulled out onto the quiet street, leaving their toxic world behind me. The panic had not started yet, but I knew it was coming. And for the first time in my 35 years, I was looking forward to the fallout. I secured a private dining room at the Capital City Club in downtown Atlanta. It was an exclusive space designed specifically for discretion, with heavy oak doors, soundproofed walls, and waiters who knew exactly when to disappear. I arrived 20 minutes early to set the stage. I placed two of the bright red folders Malik had prepared precisely in front of the heavy leather chairs where my guests would sit. Having successfully leveraged my venture capital firm to quietly purchase the primary commercial debt of my father's brokerage earlier in the week, I was now legally the biggest creditor his company had. I effectively owned the building they operated out of and the massive commercial loans keeping their daily operations afloat. But owning the debt was only the first half of the guillotine. I needed the board of directors to vote Desmond out without a messy, protracted legal war. I needed a mutiny from the inside, and I knew exactly who could hand me the keys to the castle. Promptly at noon, the heavy oak doors opened. Calvin and Harrison walked into the room. They were two of the most formidable pillars of the Atlanta business community. They were men in their late 60s who had built their wealth through decades of grueling strategic real estate investments and relentless networking. They were Desmond's oldest friends, his fraternity brothers from their college days, and the largest financial backers of his brokerage. They had known me since I was a child with braided hair running around summer barbecues. But today they were not looking at Desmond's little girl. They were looking at a senior wealth manager who had summoned them to a shadow meeting in the middle of the work week. I stood up, offering them a firm handshake and a tight professional smile. They took their seats, their eyes immediately dropping to the red folders resting on the polished mahogany table in front of them. They were men of numbers, men who had survived economic downturns and ruthless competitors. They could smell a financial crisis before a single word was spoken. I did not waste their time with pleasantries or small talk. I poured them each a glass of sparkling water and took my seat at the head of the table. I told them I requested this private meeting out of profound respect for the capital they had invested in my father's enterprise. I explained that my financial firm had recently acquired the primary commercial debt of the brokerage. Calvin frowned immediately, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed the heavy implication of that move. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and asked me directly why I was buying up debt on a company that my own father ran. He wanted to know if Desmond was in trouble or if this was some sort of aggressive internal restructuring I was handling on his behalf. I did not answer him with words. I simply gestured toward the red folders resting in front of them. "Open them," I instructed, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I advise you to look closely at the third page, specifically the vendor payouts authorized by the Vice President of Business Development over the last 24 months. Harrison opened his folder first. Calvin followed suit a second later. The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the crisp turning of thick, bright white paper as they scanned the spreadsheets Malik had so meticulously prepared. I watched their expressions shift from mild, guarded curiosity to deep confusion and finally to absolute unadulterated outrage. They saw the shell companies. They saw the offshore routing numbers moving cash into the Cayman Islands. They saw the fake marketing retainers and the fraudulent staging invoices. They saw the systematic, unmitigated theft of their personal investments. Malik had highlighted the most damaging transactions in bold red ink, making the scale of the embezzlement impossible to ignore or rationalize. Harrison dropped the folder onto the table as if the paper itself were actively burning him. His face was flushed with a dark, furious heat. He looked at me, his voice dangerously low, and asked the only question that mattered. He wanted to know if Desmond was aware that his son-in-law was robbing them blind. I told him the absolute truth. I explained that Desmond was completely oblivious. I laid out exactly how my father was so blinded by his desire to have Garrett represent the future of his company that he handed over the financial reins without ever checking the locks. I told them how Desmond elevated a mediocre white man just because he fit a certain country club aesthetic, ignoring the glaring red flags in the quarterly reports. Desmond was ignorant, but his ignorance was going to cost these men their entire multi-million-dollar investment. Calvin leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples with rough, calloused fingers. He realized instantly what the spreadsheets meant. He looked at me and stated flatly that the brokerage was running on fumes. He knew that with the operational reserves drained, the company was weeks, maybe days away from total insolvency. The moment the market shifted or a major loan payment came due, the entire enterprise would collapse like a house of cards, taking their equity down with it. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and offered them my lifeline. I told them that as the primary debt holder, I was actively preparing to foreclose on the property and seize the remaining corporate assets to cover my position. I explained that Desmond would undoubtedly try to file for bankruptcy to protect Garrett and save his own pride. He would drag them down with him just to avoid admitting he had been conned by the man he chose over his own daughter. I promised them a way out. I told them that if they backed my play to immediately remove Desmond as chief executive officer and strip Garrett of his position and shares, I would use my own portfolio to restructure their investments. I assured them that my venture capital firm would absorb the blow, stabilize the remaining profitable assets, and ensure their initial equity was salvaged before the federal authorities froze the accounts. I needed their votes on the board, and they desperately needed my capital. It was a flawless, unbreakable alliance forged in the intense fires of mutual betrayal. They were furious that the man they had trusted for 30 years had allowed a thief to drain their retirement funds. They looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between two seasoned businessmen who knew exactly when to cut their losses. The betrayal of their oldest friend cemented their decision. Harrison extended his hand across the table first. Calvin followed immediately. We shook hands, sealing the agreement. The mutiny was officially sanctioned. Desmond was completely isolated, stripped of his financial backing and his oldest allies, and he had absolutely no idea the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. I left the club feeling a dangerous, electric surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The trap was set. The net was drawn completely tight, leaving no room for escape. I drove back to my penthouse, watching the Atlanta skyline blur past my tinted windows. I felt lighter than I had in years. The heavy burden of seeking my parents' validation was gone, replaced by the sharp clarity of impending justice. I walked into my home office and opened my laptop. The Atlanta Black Business Excellence Gala was approaching rapidly, and the ticketing portal was still open for major sponsors. I navigated to the sponsorship page. I did not just buy a standard ticket. I entered my corporate banking details and dropped a massive sum to secure the Diamond VIP table. It was the premier table for the event, located dead center right at the very front of the stage. I was going to sit directly in Desmond's line of sight. I was going to be the only thing he could see when he looked down from the podium. I closed my laptop with a satisfying snap. I had secured the absolute best seat in the house for the finale, and I was going to make sure the entire city watched his fake empire burn. 2 weeks had passed since the Shadow Board meeting. Today was the day. The morning of the Atlanta Black Business Excellence Gala arrived with crisp, clear skies. I woke up feeling an intense, vibrating energy deep in my chest. I made my coffee and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The city of Atlanta stretched out below me, completely unaware of the corporate earthquake that was about to hit its elite social circles tonight. My phone chimed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. I did not need to guess who it was. The cowardice practically bled through the screen. It was Garrett. He was using a burner phone because I had already blocked his primary contact. The message was long, frantic, and dripping with his usual unearned authority. He told me that I was officially banned from the gala. He said my name had been flagged with the venue security team, and that if I dared to show my face anywhere near his family, he would personally have the Atlanta police arrest me for trespassing and harassment. He ended the text by calling me a sad, obsessive woman who could not handle being left behind. I read the message twice and actually smiled. He was terrified. He could feel the net closing in even if he did not know exactly where the trap was hidden. He truly thought a burner phone and a hollow threat about police involvement would scare me. He thought he could intimidate a black female wealth manager who literally owned the commercial debt to his entire existence. I did not reply. Silence is the most terrifying response you can give a narcissist who is rapidly losing control. I tossed the phone onto my kitchen island and went to get dressed for the office. I had a lot of printing to do. I spent the entire afternoon locked in my executive suite with Malik. We were not running numbers anymore. We were compiling the execution documents. Malik had meticulously organized the final financial autopsy report. Every offshore wire transfer, every fraudulent vendor invoice, and every shell company registration was printed on heavy, premium, bright white paper. The ink was sharp and undeniable. We took the thick stacks of evidence and placed them deliberately into sleek, unmistakable red folders. The color was highly intentional. I wanted the folders to stand out like warning beacons across the dimly lit ballroom. I wanted Desmond and Garrett to see the exact shape of their destruction resting on the tables before I even opened my mouth. I packed 12 red folders into a secure leather briefcase. 12 folders for 12 key board members, major investors, and prominent city officials sitting in our immediate vicinity. But having the evidence was only half the battle. I needed to ensure I had the voice to deliver it. My father was a master of controlling the narrative. If I stood up and started speaking without a microphone, he would simply signal the event coordinators to play the exit music or have me drowned out by the master of ceremonies. I could not leave my platform to chance. I picked up my office phone and dialed a direct line I had saved from a corporate buyout I managed 3 years ago. The man who answered was the chief audio-visual director for the grand ballroom where the gala was being held. Back then, I had helped restructure his independent contracting firm, saving his business from a predatory lending trap that would have bankrupted him. He owed me a massive favor, and he was fiercely loyal. I told him I was attending the gala that evening and sitting at the Diamond VIP table. I explained that I needed a live, unmutable microphone stationed at my table, and I needed absolute certainty that the soundboard would not be cut off by anyone on the stage or in the production booth. He did not ask for details or question my motives. He simply laughed, told me he had my back, and promised that my microphone would override the main system the second I switched it on. With the logistics perfectly secured, I left my office and headed back to my penthouse to prepare for the evening. Getting ready was not just about putting on a dress. It was about putting on my armor. I hired a private styling team to come to my home because I wanted to look completely untouchable. I chose a floor-length emerald green gown that fit like a second skin. It radiated elegance and cold, hard power. My hair was styled in a flawless, sleek updo that pulled my features sharp and focused. My makeup was pristine. I slipped on a pair of diamond drop earrings that I had bought for myself to celebrate my first $1 million quarter. I looked in the full-length mirror. I did not look like the scapegoat daughter. I did not look like the bitter spinster my mother had tried to paint me as to her church friends. I looked like a woman who owned the building and everyone inside it. At 7 o'clock sharp, my private security team arrived. I had hired 2 broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed men who would ensure that neither Garrett nor my father's friends could lay a hand on me when the chaos erupted. We rode the elevator down to the private garage, where a chauffeur-driven black car was waiting. I handed the leather briefcase full of red folders to my lead security officer. The drive through downtown Atlanta felt like a victory lap before the race even began. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the venue. Flashbulbs were popping as the city's elite made their way down the red carpet, showing off their designer outfits and fake smiles. The chauffeur opened my door. I stepped out into the cool evening air, the emerald fabric of my gown catching the flashing lights of the cameras. I took the red folders from my security guard, holding them effortlessly in one hand. I kept my chin high, my expression perfectly blank, and walked toward the grand ballroom doors. I was ready to bring the entire empire down to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, pulled back by two venue attendants wearing crisp uniforms and white gloves. The air inside hit me instantly. It was a thick, overwhelming mixture of expensive floral perfumes, aged bourbon, and the undeniable heavy scent of Atlanta high society. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests gathered in the sprawling space. This was the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence in the city. Politicians, real estate moguls, and prominent megachurch pastors mingled around tables draped in sleek black silk and adorned with towering white floral centerpieces. I stepped over the threshold, my emerald green designer gown flowing seamlessly around my ankles, the rich fabric catching the light with every deliberate step I took. The ambient noise near the entrance dipped almost immediately. I could feel the collective shift in energy as eyes darted toward me. Yvonne and Jada had spent the last 2 weeks working overtime to destroy my name. They had called every sorority sister, every church elder, and every country club socialite they knew to paint me as a bitter, unstable outcast who was actively trying to ruin her own loving family out of pure jealousy. I saw a group of my mother's closest friends standing near an elaborate ice sculpture. They stopped talking mid-sentence. I watched their eyes dart toward me, their expressions rapidly hardening into masks of open disdain. I heard the hushed, aggressive whispers rippling through the crowd. I saw the judgmental shakes of their heads and the sideways glances. 2 weeks ago, that unified wall of social rejection might have stung my pride. 2 weeks ago, the thought of being shunned by the community I grew up in would have triggered that old, familiar childhood anxiety. Today, it only fueled me. I did not shrink into myself. I did not avert my gaze or look down at the floor. I walked right past them with my head held perfectly high, my spine straight, and my face an absolute mask of cold, untouchable composure. I let them whisper. They were whispering about a ghost. The fragile, people-pleasing woman they thought they were judging did not exist anymore. I was not the scapegoat daughter begging for a seat at their table. I was the executioner walking to the block, and I was holding the axe. My two private security guards walked a half-step behind me, their broad shoulders and imposing presence clearing a wide path through the crowded room. We bypassed the standard seating areas. We bypassed the premium corporate sponsor tables. I walked straight down the center aisle, directly toward the brightly lit main stage. I reached the Diamond VIP table. It was undeniably the best seat in the entire venue, positioned dead center, mere feet from the podium. A thick velvet rope cordoned off the private space. One of my guards unclipped the rope and pulled out my chair. I took my seat gracefully, placing the heavy leather briefcase containing the 12 red folders gently on the floor, right next to my feet. I smoothed the fabric of my gown and looked up at the stage. Desmond was standing near the heavy velvet curtain in the stage wing, waiting for his cue to be introduced. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, laughing loudly with the mayor of Atlanta and several local politicians. But then he turned his head, and his eyes locked directly onto mine. I watched the confident, booming patriarch completely freeze. The bright, charismatic smile practically fell off his face. I could see the exact moment the sheer panic hit his chest. He reached up and nervously adjusted his bow tie, his fingers fumbling slightly against his collar. I saw a visible bead of sweat form near his temple under the harsh stage lights. He tried to quickly mask his fear with a glare of pure, concentrated arrogance puffing out his chest and turning his attention back to the mayor. But I saw his hands shaking. He knew I had frozen his corporate accounts. He knew I had formally demanded my $150,000 loan back. But he had absolutely no idea that I now legally owned the primary commercial debt to his entire existence. He thought I was just crashing his prestigious party to cause a petty emotional scene. He had no idea he was standing on a trap door. To the left of the stage, seated at the prominently displayed honorary family table, I saw Yvonne and Jada. Yvonne gripped her champagne flute so hard I thought the delicate crystal might actually shatter in her hand. Her face was pale, her jaw clenched tight with silent fury. Jada leaned over and whispered frantically to Garrett, her eyes darting nervously in my direction. Garrett simply rolled his eyes, looking down at me with total unearned dismissal. He let out a scoff and took a sip of his drink. He truly believed his white privilege and his fabricated corporate title made him untouchable. He looked at me like I was a minor inconvenience, completely oblivious to the fact that I held his federal indictment in my briefcase. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, leaving only the main stage brilliantly illuminated. The lively chatter in the room died down as the mayor took the microphone to begin the ceremony. He delivered a glowing 10-minute introduction, praising Desmond as a pioneer of commercial real estate and a shining example of community leadership. The applause was deafening as my father walked out to the center of the stage. He took the podium, gripping the wooden edges with both hands, soaking in the absolute adoration of the massive crowd. He leaned into the microphone, his deep booming voice filling the room, echoing off the high ceilings. He spoke passionately about his humble beginnings. He talked about fighting through decades of systemic barriers to build a successful brokerage from the ground up. He preached to the audience about the sacred value of generational wealth, the importance of Black excellence, and the unbreakable holy bonds of family loyalty. He told the captivated crowd that true success is not measured by the money in your bank account, but by the pristine legacy you leave behind for your children to inherit. It was a masterclass in profound, staggering hypocrisy. I sat perfectly still, my face betraying absolutely nothing, listening to the man who had emotionally and financially abused his own Black daughter just to fund the criminal lifestyle of his white son-in-law. He spoke about unwavering integrity, while his operational reserves were completely drained. He spoke about building a lasting empire, while he was standing mere days away from total catastrophic bankruptcy. I looked around the room at the wealthy investors, the powerful politicians, and the elite socialites clapping enthusiastically for his profound wisdom. They were clapping for a ghost ship. They were applauding a man who was already financially deceased. I felt the heavy weight of the red folders inside my briefcase resting against my ankle. Every single word of his magnificent speech was just adding another nail to his own coffin, and I was going to let him finish hammering it shut. Desmond raised his hands, gesturing gracefully for the thunderous applause to quiet down. His face was flushed with the intense high of his own perceived glory. He smiled broadly, looking directly over my head toward the family table, refusing to acknowledge my presence right in front of him. He leaned closer to the microphone. He told the crowd that a legacy is only as strong as the people who carry it forward. He asked his beautiful daughter Jada and his brilliant vice president of business development Garrett to please stand up and be recognized. He called Garrett the absolute future of the company, praising him as a man of unmatched vision and impeccable integrity who would surely steer the real estate brokerage into a new era of unprecedented prosperity. Jada and Garrett stood up proudly. The bright spotlight swung over to hit their table, illuminating them for the entire room to see. The ballroom erupted into another round of enthusiastic applause. Garrett smiled, waving humbly to the crowd, placing a loving hand on Jada's back, basking entirely in the stolen glow of my father's empire. The sheer blinding delusion of the moment had finally reached its absolute peak. It was time. I reached onto the pristine white tablecloth and picked up my heavy crystal water glass in my left hand. I picked up a solid silver dessert spoon in my right. I stood up slowly from my chair, my movements deliberate and completely unhurried. My emerald gown caught the light spilling from the stage, shimmering brilliantly in the dark room. My two security guards immediately stepped forward, forming a solid protective wall behind my chair. I raised the silver spoon and tapped it firmly against the rim of the crystal glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the dying applause like a blade, bringing the entire ballroom to a sudden, breathless halt. I am Kendra, 35 years old, and until last Sunday, I was the silent bankroll keeping my family and their fake empire afloat. At our weekly dinner, I casually mentioned my excitement for our upcoming luxury vacation to Cabo. My father looked me dead in the eye and laughed. "It is only for family," he said, "and without a husband or kids, you simply do not qualify." My sister and her husband laughed loudly as they claimed my oceanfront suite. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just quietly walked out. What they conveniently forgot was that the corporate black card funding their entire lavish lifestyle had my name on it. When my father tried to withdraw $5,000 a few days later, I hit block and sent a 3-word text that shattered his reality entirely. The air inside my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive wine, and heavy pretension. It was our usual Sunday family dinner, a ritual I had endured for years, out of a misplaced sense of duty. My life was a relentless cycle of 60-hour work weeks, analyzing portfolios, managing high-net-worth clients, and building my own independence as a senior wealth manager at a top-tier financial firm. I was exhausted, running on pure caffeine and the promise of our upcoming luxury family trip to Cabo San Lucas. I had been looking forward to that white sand and blue water for 6 solid months. I pushed my food around my plate, trying to engage in the conversation. I took a sip of my sparkling water and offered a tired but genuine smile. I told them I could not wait for our vacation next week. I explained that I really needed to disconnect, that 60 hours this week alone had my brain completely fried, and that Cabo was going to be the perfect reset for all of us. The clinking of silverware against fine china stopped. The silence that fell over the dining room was immediate and suffocating. My father Desmond, a man whose pride was only outmatched by his arrogance, slowly cut a piece of his steak. He did not look up at me. He simply chewed his food, swallowed, and let out a low, mocking laugh that echoed in the cavernous room. "It is only for family." "Kendra," he said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather, rather than cutting me out of a trip I had spent months planning. "You are not coming. Without you, it will actually be a family trip." I froze. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Across the table, my older sister Jada let out a loud, cruel snort of laughter. Jada was the undisputed golden child of the family. She had failed out of her marketing degree program 3 separate times, but she had managed to marry Garrett, a white man with a supposedly impressive background who fit perfectly into my parents' vision of elevated social status. Garrett leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon, and joined in his wife's laughter. The sound of his smug, entitled chuckle in my parents' dining room grated against my every nerve. I looked toward my mother, expecting some kind of intervention, some baseline level of maternal defense. Yvonne simply adjusted her silk blouse, took a delicate sip of her red wine, and looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. She told me to be reasonable. She stated smoothly, completely unbothered by the cruelty of the moment, that since I was single and childless, Jada and Garrett needed the extra space. They needed my oceanfront suite for their kids, she claimed, adding that it just made more sense. Besides, she told me I would just bring down the mood anyway. She said I was always so serious and focused on work, and that a family vacation was for people who had actually built a family. The sheer audacity of her statement felt like a physical blow to my chest. I did not scream. I did not throw my napkin down. I did not burst into tears like the fragile, broken daughter they desperately wanted me to be. Instead, I sat perfectly still and let my eyes wander around the room, taking in the physical evidence of their staggering hypocrisy. I looked down at the massive custom-built mahogany dining table where we were all seated. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that seated 12 people comfortably. My father loved to brag about it to his golf buddies. What he never mentioned was that I was the one who quietly paid for it. When his real estate brokerage missed a crucial quarter 2 years ago, and he was facing the humiliation of downsizing, I was the one who wrote the check to keep his image intact. I looked up at the glittering crystal chandelier hanging above us, another luxury I had funded to maintain the illusion of Desmond's unstoppable success. I went to Howard University on a full academic scholarship because my parents refused to pay my tuition, claiming they needed the funds to support Jada's endless attempts at finding herself. I built my career from the ground up. I earned every promotion, every bonus, and every ounce of respect I held in the financial district. I had been paying the second mortgage on this very estate for 3 years, keeping the roof over their heads while they paraded around Atlanta high society. And yet, sitting here, I was nothing to them but an automated teller machine they could insult for entertainment. The silence stretched on heavy with their expectation that I would apologize for making things awkward, or perhaps beg to be included, promising to pay for my own separate room. Garrett smirked at me, clearly enjoying the dynamic where the successful black woman was put in her place by her own family. Jada whispered something to him and they shared another quiet laugh. I slowly reached for my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my untouched plate. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. My mother asked where I was going, her voice laced with irritation. She reminded me they had not even served dessert yet and told me not to be dramatic. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of my anger. I simply looked at my father, who finally raised his eyes to meet mine. I nodded politely, a gesture so cold and detached it made his confident expression waver for just a fraction of a second. I told them to enjoy their dessert and to enjoy Cabo. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I retrieved my designer coat from the entryway closet, slipping it on as I opened the heavy front door. I stepped out into the cool Atlanta evening, pulling the door shut behind me with a firm, decisive click. I did not slam it. Slamming it would imply I was out of control. I was entirely in control. I walked down the manicured driveway to my car, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pristine paving stones. I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle, relishing the absolute quiet of the insulated cabin. The engine hummed to life, but I did not put the car in drive right away. I sat there, the streetlights reflecting off my windshield, processing the reality of what had just happened. My family had explicitly told me I meant nothing to them beyond what I could provide. They had drawn their line in the sand. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my secure banking application, bypassing the biometric lock, and navigated to the corporate account section. There it was, the exclusive corporate black card. The lifeblood of Desmond's real estate brokerage and the magical plastic that funded his expensive suits, his lavish dinners, and his upcoming family vacation. The account was entirely under my name. It was backed by my credit, my assets, and my hard work. I had set it up years ago as a lifeline when his business was failing, allowing him to save face and pretend he was still the king of his castle. I stared at the screen, watching the numbers reflect a reality my family chose to ignore. My thumb hovered over the settings menu. I navigated to the card management controls. The words "lock account" glowed on the screen. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. They wanted a family vacation without me. They were about to learn exactly how much of their family was built on my back. I thought about Jada packing her designer luggage, preparing to lounge by an infinity pool that I was financing. I thought about Garrett drinking top-shelf liquor on my dime while looking down his nose at me. I thought about my mother, who cared more about the optics of a perfect family photo on a beach than the feelings of her own daughter. And I thought about my father, a man so blinded by his own toxic pride that he believed he could bite the hand that fed him without ever facing starvation. They had demanded I respect their boundaries regarding what constitutes a family. It was only right that I enforce my own boundaries regarding what constitutes my money. The days of silent compliance were over. The days of buying their conditional love were finished. I took one last look at the glowing facade of my parents' estate through my rearview mirror. It looked like a fortress, but I knew it was nothing more than a house of cards. And I was holding the bottom card. My thumb hovered just above the glass screen, feeling the cool surface under my skin. The panic had not started yet, but I knew it was coming. And for the first time in my 35 years, I was looking forward to the fallout. I held the heavy red folder high above my head, the bright crimson cover standing out like a flare in the golden ambient light of the ballroom. I did not break eye contact with my father standing frozen on the stage. I slowly lowered my arm and gave a subtle, practiced nod to the perimeter of the room. Malik, dressed in a sharp, tailored tuxedo, stepped out from the shadows alongside my security team. They moved through the crowd with surgical precision. They did not hand a folder to just anyone. They approached the specific tables I had mapped out well in advance. Calvin and Harrison received the first copies. The mayor of Atlanta received the next. The prominent real estate developers, the mega church pastors, the bank executives, who had foolishly floated my father his secondary loans, they all received a bright red folder placed directly on top of their pristine white table linens. I lifted the microphone back to my mouth. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing off the high ceilings of the grand ballroom with absolute clarity. I told them to open the files. I told them to look closely at the legacy they were currently giving a standing ovation to. The sound of thick paper turning filled the massive space. It sounded like a storm rolling in over the ocean. I did not give them time to guess what they were looking at. I read the numbers aloud. I projected the truth into every corner of the room so that no one could claim ignorance. $2.5 million, I stated, enunciating every single syllable. That is the exact amount of operational capital that has been systematically siphoned out of this brokerage over the last 36 months. I directed the entire room's attention to the man sitting frozen at the honoree family table. I told them to look closely at the brilliant future of the company, the man my father just spent 10 minutes praising as a visionary. I explained the exact anatomy of the theft. I detailed the shell corporation registered under Garrett's personal name. I exposed the fake vendor invoices for property staging services that never existed. I listed the offshore wire routing numbers moving stolen equity straight into the Cayman Islands. I made it explicitly clear that Garrett had used my father's blind, desperate need for white country club validation to rob his investors completely blind. I watched Jada sitting at her table. The smug, entitled grin she had worn for 35 years completely melted off her face. She looked at the red folder the mayor had just opened at the adjacent table, catching a glimpse of the bank statements bearing her husband's name. The crushing reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. Her perfect white knight, the man who elevated her social status and validated her existence in my parents' eyes, was a common criminal. Her designer gowns, her luxury vehicles, her impending vacation to Cabo San Lucas, all of it was funded by stolen money that no longer existed. She was completely broke. Yvonne sat perfectly paralyzed in her chair. The women from her sorority alumni network, the same women she had weaponized against me all week, were now staring at her with wide-eyed, undisguised horror. The vicious social execution she had tried to orchestrate against me had just reversed direction with brutal force. She had spent days telling the entire church community that I was a rogue, unstable spinster trying to ruin my family out of pure jealousy. Now, those same people were looking at the undeniable proof that her golden son-in-law was a felon and her entire life was a debt-fueled lie. The social standing she worshipped above her own daughter was evaporating in real time. Garrett realized the walls had completely closed in. He knew the red folders were not just internal audit documents. They were a perfectly packaged federal indictment. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him a sickly, ghostly pale. He stood up so fast that his chair tipped backward and crashed heavily onto the marble floor. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling hand, shattering violently against the ground, the sharp sound echoing through the tense room. He did not try to defend himself. He did not try to comfort his hyperventilating wife. He turned his back on Jada and bolted for the grand oak doors at the back of the ballroom. He was a coward running from the consequences of his own arrogance, but I had anticipated that move as well. As Garrett hit the heavy doors and shoved them open, he practically slammed into the broad chests of my private security detail, who were standing shoulder to shoulder with the venue guards. They easily overpowered him, forcing him back into the room and physically blocking every possible exit. There was nowhere to run. The trap was completely sealed. The ballroom descended into absolute unmitigated chaos. The polite, refined murmurs of Atlanta high society vanished, replaced by the furious, aggressive shouts of betrayed investors. Calvin stood up from his table, his face dark with a terrifying rage. He threw his red folder directly onto the stage, the papers scattering at my father's feet. He shouted at Desmond, his voice cracking with anger, demanding to know how he could let a common thief rob his oldest friends blind. Harrison joined in, his booming voice cutting through the crowd, declaring that the board was staging an immediate emergency vote to strip Desmond of his title and seize whatever assets were left in the building. The mayor quietly signaled his security detail and quickly moved toward the side exit, eager to distance himself from the toxic career-ending fallout of a massive federal fraud scandal. Desmond stood frozen at the podium. The Lifetime Achievement Award he was supposed to receive sat abandoned on a velvet display table nearby, completely forgotten by everyone in the room. He looked out at the angry mob of investors he had spent decades trying to impress. He looked at the shattered remains of his reputation. His brokerage was gone. His money was gone. His golden son-in-law was trapped at the back of the room waiting for the police to arrive. Desmond was utterly and comprehensively destroyed. Stripped of his pride, his arrogance, and his fake empire, my father abandoned the stage. He practically stumbled down the carpeted stairs, his knees visibly shaking. He pushed past the angry investors who were demanding answers and repayment. His eyes were wide, frantic, and desperate. He rushed directly toward my diamond VIP table at the front of the room. The imposing wall of my security guards stepped forward to intercept him, their hands raised to stop his advance, but I raised my hand, signaling them to stand down and let him approach. I wanted to hear exactly what he had to say. My father stopped inches from my table. He looked down at me, his chest heaving, his face covered in a thick sheen of sweat. The powerful, commanding patriarch who had laughed in my face at Sunday dinner was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man facing total financial ruin. In front of the entire elite community that had shunned me just days prior, he dropped his pride completely. His voice cracked as he begged me. "Kendra, please," he pleaded, his hands shaking as he reached out toward the edge of my table. "Please fix this. Stop the foreclosure. Call off the bank. We can handle this internally. We can pay the investors back. Please, Kendra. We are family." I looked down at the man who had spent 35 years making me feel completely invisible. His expensive custom-tailored tuxedo was wrinkled, his face slick with the cold sweat of his own manufactured destruction. He was pleading with me, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of my VIP table. He was using the very word he had weaponized against me just weeks ago to justify my exclusion: family. He said the word as if it were a magical spell that could instantly erase decades of emotional abuse and financial exploitation. I let the word hang in the charged, heavy air between us. I listened to the furious shouts of the investors behind him, the chaotic scrambling of the elite attendees trying to distance themselves from a fallen titan. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel the familiar, ingrained childhood urge to shrink myself to make him comfortable. I stood perfectly still, my expression a completely blank canvas of absolute, untouchable indifference. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and he knew it. I looked him dead in the eye, watching the last shred of his arrogant pride crumble into dust, and delivered the final blow. "I am sorry, Dad," I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. "Mercy is only for family. Without you." I did not wait to see the final tear fall from his eye or hear whatever pathetic justification he was about to offer. I turned my back on him with the graceful precision of a woman who had finally realized her own worth. I signaled my security detail, and together we walked out of the grand ballroom. The sound of his desperate pleading voice was entirely drowned out by the angry shouts of the investors swarming him like sharks scenting blood in the water. I walked out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night, stepped into the back of my waiting chauffeur-driven car, and drove away from their toxic, parasitic world forever. Fast forward 3 months. The corporate autopsy of my father's real estate brokerage was swift, brutal, and entirely public. When the federal authorities and financial regulators verified the staggering evidence contained in those red folders, they did not just freeze the corporate accounts. They seized absolutely everything. As the primary commercial debt holder, I systematically liquidated the remaining viable assets of Desmond's company and absorbed them directly into my own expansive financial portfolio. I stripped the prestigious family name from the commercial building downtown and sold the physical office space to an emerging tech startup. Desmond's precious legacy, the empire he loved and protected more than his own daughter, was erased from the Atlanta Business Registry completely. Garrett did not fare any better. In fact, his descent was the most precipitous of all. The morning after the gala, federal agents arrived at his sprawling suburban home just as the sun was coming up. They did not knock politely and ask for a meeting. They executed a no-knock warrant, escorting the brilliant future of the company out the front door in handcuffs, while the wealthy neighbors watched from their manicured lawns in stunned silence. Malik and my legal team had handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a perfectly wrapped, undeniable case of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Garrett was officially indicted on 27 federal counts. With his offshore accounts permanently frozen and his network of shell companies dismantled by the feds, he could not afford a high-priced miracle-working defense attorney. He was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, denied bail because he was considered a flight risk awaiting a trial that would almost certainly end with a lengthy, devastating prison sentence. The smug, entitled grin he wore at Sunday dinner was permanently gone, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of a federal jumpsuit. The collateral damage to the rest of the family was a masterclass in poetic justice. Jada, the undisputed golden child who had spent her entire life looking down her nose at me, found herself completely cut off from the wealth she had so arrogantly flaunted. With Garrett's assets seized by the government and the brokerage completely destroyed, her luxury vehicles were repossessed within weeks. The designer handbags, the custom diamond jewelry, and the expensive shoes she used to belittle others were hastily pawned just to pay for basic legal consultations and overdue utility bills. Stripped of her silent financial sponsor, Jada was forced to face the harsh reality of her own incompetence. She currently works a minimum-wage retail job at a mid-tier department store in a neighboring suburb, folding the very clothes and ringing up the exact type of customers she used to relentlessly mock. The absolute humiliation of her new reality was entirely self-inflicted, a direct result of biting the hand that fed her. Yvonne suffered a fate that to a woman of her superficial nature was significantly worse than financial bankruptcy. She suffered a total and complete social death. The prominent women from her prestigious sorority alumni network and the wealthy elders at her megachurch did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. They distanced themselves immediately, treating her like a highly contagious pariah. The false, vicious narrative she had spun about my mental instability had backfired so spectacularly that nobody in Atlanta high society would even return her phone calls. The sheer embarrassment of having championed a son-in-law who stole millions of dollars from the community made her an outcast. Unable to pay the massive second mortgage on the sprawling estate without my monthly wire transfers, the bank inevitably foreclosed on the property. Yvonne was forced to pack up her remaining shreds of dignity, sell off her luxury furniture at embarrassing discounts, and move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She had spent her entire life worshiping social status and public perception, and now she was forced to live in absolute undeniable obscurity. As for me, I finally took that vacation. I am currently sitting in a plush, oversized leather seat in the first-class cabin of a direct flight to Cabo San Lucas. I am looking out the window as the plane steadily ascends, watching the sprawling Atlanta skyline shrink into the distance. But I am not traveling alone. I am surrounded by my true circle of friends. Malik is sitting across the aisle from me, laughing loudly at a joke made by Jonathan, my lead corporate attorney. My chosen family, the people who actually celebrate my success without jealousy, protect my peace without hesitation, and uplift my spirit without condition, are all here with me. We are taking the massive oceanfront suites, and we are going to enjoy every single second of it. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my chilled champagne, letting the crisp, sweet flavor wash over my tongue. I lean back against the soft leather, closing my eyes for a brief moment, and reflect on the profound, weightless peace that comes from severing toxic ties. I realize now that I did not just execute a flawless revenge plot against the people who emotionally and financially abused me. I did something much more important. I broke the generational curse of conditional love and manipulation. I took back my power, my hard-earned wealth, and my personal narrative. I did not just get justice, I gained my absolute, unapologetic freedom. If you are watching this and you have ever been the designated scapegoat in your own family, I want you to remember something very important. Your worth is never determined by people who only value what they can extract from you. You do not owe your success, your inner peace, or your financial resources to anyone who disrespects your fundamental existence. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor, not a transactional battlefield. Sometimes the most powerful, self-loving thing you can do is lock the account, revoke their access to your energy, and simply walk away. You deserve to sit at a table where your presence is celebrated, not tolerated. Let me know what you thought of my story in the comments below. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace of mind? Share your experiences. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, establishing boundaries, and executing sweet revenge. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember, family is not just about shared bloodlines. Family is about who respects you enough to never make you feel like you have to buy your seat at the table. Your worth is never determined by family members who only value you for what they can extract from your success. Shared blood does not entitle anyone to disrespect your boundaries or treat you like a disposable financial resource. True empowerment comes from recognizing your inherent value and having the courage to sever toxic ties without a single ounce of guilt. You must be willing to walk away from tables where your presence is merely tolerated instead of celebrated. Ultimately, the most profound act of self-love is closing the account, ending the manipulation, and reclaiming your absolute unapologetic personal freedom forever. If you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace, hit that like button, subscribe for more empowering stories, and share your own journey in the comments below.